Have you ever seen someone who looks like they have everything, but somehow you can tell they're completely alone? The kind of loneliness that hides behind perfect suits, expensive cars, and the kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. That's where this story begins. A man who's built an empire, but lost himself somewhere along the way. Before we begin, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below, and let's share a quiet moment together. Now, let me tell you about the day the richest man in the city met a little girl who changed everything. The day a stranger's simple question, "Are you sad, mister?" cracked open the walls around his heart. This is the story of Kaelen Vance, the story of a man who had everything, until one small voice reminded him what really matters: the weight of silence. The rain fell softly against the glass and concrete of the city, turning everything to shades of silver and gray. On a park bench, a man sat motionless beneath the muted sky. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished, his posture perfect, but his eyes carried the heavy, hollow stillness of someone who'd forgotten how to look at the world. His name was Kaelen Vance, a man who could move markets with a word, a man who had everything, except anyone to call when the noise stopped. The rain gathered on his wristwatch, each droplet sliding across the shining metal like time itself refusing to stand still. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. A car horn echoed, but none of it reached him. In his pocket, his phone vibrated once, sharp against the silence. He glanced down. One unread message: "I'm sorry for your loss." The glow of the screen lit his face for a moment before fading back into gray. He slipped the phone away, as though hiding the words could make them untrue. Around him, life went on. Umbrellas hurried by. Conversations drifted past like ghosts. The world saw only a powerful man taking a quiet moment. No one noticed the small tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie, or the exhaustion clinging to the edges of his gaze. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching rain ripple through puddles on the pavement. Once, he had measured everything: profit, success, control. But the one thing he'd never learned to measure was what it cost to be alone. He closed his eyes for a breath that came too shallow, then looked upward into grayness, as though searching for something he'd lost long ago. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was her voice. Maybe it was just the sound of someone who cared enough to ask how he was doing. The rain softened, slowing to a quiet drizzle. His world, for all its wealth and order, felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. And somewhere behind him, a small pair of footsteps splashed through the puddles. He didn't notice the child yet, or the tiny hand that would soon reach for him. But before this day was over, that silence, the silence that had built his home inside him, would finally be broken. And it would begin with 6 simple words. "Are you sad, mister?" Morning came like it always did for Kaelen Vance, quiet, efficient, predictable. The sun filtered through walls of glass, spilling across a penthouse that overlooked the city he'd conquered. Everything in its place. No dust, no clutter, no warmth. He stood before the window, coffee untouched, the skyline stretching endlessly below. From this height, even the chaos of the city looked orderly, tiny cars crawling like threads in a perfect pattern. He liked it that way. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Behind him, his phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession. A meeting reminder, a briefing, another investor dinner. His assistant's voice came through the intercom, practiced and polite. "Mr. Vance, the car will be ready in 5. He didn't answer right away. Just watched the reflection of his own face in the glass. The same sharp jawline, the same tail of perfection, and behind it, the same emptiness. They called him a visionary. They said he built an empire out of nothing. But what they never saw, what they couldn't see, was that he'd built it out of loneliness. He'd learned early that people smiled wider when he paid for things. That loyalty came easiest with bonuses attached. So he gave the world what it wanted: power, money, control, and in return, the world took everything else. At the office, the glass walls gleamed. His reflection followed him everywhere, crisp and clear, his own silent companion. Employees nodded respectfully as he passed. No one met his eyes for long. He was the kind of man people admired from a distance. In the boardroom, screens glowed with charts and numbers. Someone was talking. He wasn't listening. His gaze drifted to the window again. The city sprawled beneath him like a painting he no longer understood. He remembered the first time he'd stood here, years ago, proud and certain. Now, it all felt like someone else's story. A voice cut through the air. "Mr. Vance, are we moving forward with the acquisition?" He blinked once. "Yes," he said flatly. The room nodded in approval, mistaking silence for confidence. But inside, the noise was deafening. Every word in that room felt hollow, rehearsed. Every smile came with a cost. And as he looked around the table, it struck him how easily success could turn into a kind of prison, a kingdom made of glass, where everything shined but nothing was real. Later that night, he sat alone in the back of his limousine. The city lights flickered across his face as skyscrapers rolled past. Through the tinted glass, he could see people on the sidewalks, talking, laughing, living. For a moment, he wondered what it would be like to be one of them, to walk in the rain without a destination, without a title, without anyone expecting anything. The thought lingered longer than it should have. When the car stopped at a red light, he caught his reflection again in the window. Same suit, same calm expression, same stranger staring back. And somewhere deep inside, something small and tired whispered, "This can't be all there is." He didn't know it yet, but that whisper, that single fleeting ache for something real, was a first crack forming in his perfect, glass-built world. The day began like every other, precise, polished, controlled. Kaelen Vance sat behind his glass desk, surrounded by the quiet hum of success. But inside, something was breaking. The meeting had gone wrong. Investors were restless. A deal he'd built for months crumbled in minutes. And the words that followed, "You're losing your edge, Vance," lingered long after the boardroom emptied. He stared at his reflection in the dark window. Flawless suit, perfect tie, lifeless eyes. For years, that mask had protected him. But today it felt heavy. Too tight. He loosened his tie, ran a hand through his hair, and for a brief moment, let himself feel it. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet ache that had no name. Outside, the city kept moving, uncaring. But Kaelen Vance, the man who never broke, finally felt the first crack form in the armor he'd spent a lifetime building. He didn't know it yet, but that crack was how the light would one day find its way in. The park was quiet that afternoon. The rain had slowed to a mist, leaving behind the soft scent of wet earth and asphalt. Kaelen sat on the same bench where he'd ended his morning meetings in silence, his suit slightly rumpled, his tie loosened. The world around him moved on, as if unaware that a man like him could be unraveling quietly, cell by cell. His phone lay on the bench beside him, screen dark. He hadn't spoken a word in hours. He just watched. People walking dogs. Runners passing by with earbuds in. A couple sharing coffee beneath an umbrella. Every scene around him felt like something happening on the other side of a window. He could see it, but he couldn't feel it. He rubbed his eyes once, fingers pressing against the bridge of his nose. The fatigue wasn't just physical. It was somewhere deeper, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. And then, a tiny voice broke through the drizzle. "Hi." He blinked, lowering his hand. Standing in front of him was a little girl. 5, maybe 6 years old. Blonde curls damp from the mist. A pink dress spotted with raindrops. In one hand, she held a small paper cup of melted ice cream. She tilted her head, studying the way only children can. Openly, curiously, without fear or filter. He stared back, uncertain, like someone waking up mid-dream. Before he could say a word, she reached out and tugged lightly at the sleeve of his suit jacket. "Are you sad, mister?" The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, disarming. Kaelen froze. It had been years since anyone had looked at him like that. Years since anyone had asked how he felt without wanting something in return. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. He hesitated, the practiced mask of composure flickering. "I'm fine." She frowned a little, not convinced. "You don't look fine." He almost smiled. "Almost? What makes you think that?" "You were staring at the ground," she said matter-of-factly, And people only do that when they're sad or when they drop something. Her innocence caught him completely off guard. He let out a small breath, half a sigh, half a laugh. I didn't drop anything. Then you're sad, she said simply. The words landed heavier than she could possibly understand. He looked at her, really looked. The way her curls stuck to her cheeks, the little scrape on her knee, the absolute sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of him. She didn't see a CEO or a billionaire or a man with headlines attached to his name. She just saw someone who looked sad in the rain. For the first time in what felt like years, Kaelen didn't have an answer ready. The armor he wore in every conversation, the polished charm, the calculated control, none of it seemed to fit here. He swallowed, searching for words. You shouldn't talk to strangers, you know. She grinned. You don't look like a stranger. A laugh slipped out of him before he could stop it. It was small, rough around the edges, but real. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard that sound come from himself. The girl smiled wider, proud of herself. See? You smiled. Kaelen looked down, shaking his head slightly, a faint warmth creeping into his chest. The feeling was strange, unfamiliar, but it felt good. Maybe just a little, he admitted quietly. The girl nodded, satisfied with her work, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city faded into a soft blur around them, just a lonely man and a little girl beneath the gray sky. And in that fragile silence, something inside him shifted. A door he'd kept locked for too long creaked open just enough to let the light in. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. But in that one simple question, are you sad, mister? Kaelen Vance felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt seen. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the park wrapped in that quiet stillness that only follows a storm. A few drops still clung to the leaves, catching the pale afternoon light. Kaelen sat there, hands resting loosely on his knees, while the little girl stayed in front of him, still watching him with that same open, curious gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world had slowed to something fragile and soft. Then she broke the silence. My mom says when people are sad, they should talk about it. Kaelen's brow lifted slightly. Does your mom say that? She nodded with a kind of seriousness only a child could pull off. She says talking helps. And cookies. But mostly talking. A small laugh escaped him. Not a business laugh, the polite, controlled kind he gave in meetings, but something lighter, unguarded. I see. So, which one do you think I need? Both, she said confidently, then frowned as though correcting herself. Maybe more cookies, though. He smiled, an actual, quiet smile that softened the lines of his face. You might be right about that. She shifted her weight, twisting the hem of her pink dress between her fingers. Why were you sitting here all alone? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked it so directly. He opened his mouth, then stopped. He could have said something smooth, something detached, but the truth slipped out instead. I don't really have anyone to sit with. Her little face softened, and she nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she should. That's sad, she said softly. You look like you should have lots of friends. I used to, he said quietly. But sometimes people go away. Do you miss them? He looked down at his hands, at the faint tremor in them. Every day. She thought about that for a moment, the kind of long, innocent thinking that doesn't rush to fill the silence. Then she smiled again. You can sit with me then. I'm good at sitting. That made him laugh again, this time fuller, warmer. I can tell. She beamed, pleased with herself, then suddenly rummaged in the little bag she carried. Here, she said, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. You can have this. I made it. He took it carefully, unfolding it. It was a drawing, done in bright crayons, of a stick-figure man standing beside a smiling sun. The colors bled a little from the damp air. That's you, she said, pointing. You look sad, so I made you a happy sun. It makes everything better. He stared at it longer than he meant to. Something in his chest tightened, then eased. Thank you, he whispered. It's beautiful. She tilted her head again, watching him quietly. You're welcome, mister. For a while, they just sat there, the billionaire and the little girl, surrounded by the hum of the city and the faint rustle of leaves. He realized he hadn't felt this kind of peace in years. Not from boardrooms, not from headlines, not even from success. From her, there was no pretense, no agenda, just honesty. It was disarming and healing. Finally, she asked softly, "Do you feel better now?" Kaelen looked at the paper again, at the small, smiling sun. Then he looked at her, and for the first time in a long, long while, he told the truth. "Yeah," he said, "I think I do." The little girl smiled, satisfied. "Good. I don't like it when people are sad." He nodded, voice almost a whisper. "Neither do I." The clouds had started to break apart above them, streaks of sunlight reaching through, and as the light touched his face, Kaelen Vance, who once believed he was made entirely of glass and distance, felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Warmth. And though he didn't know it yet, this small conversation, the simplest of exchanges, was about to change everything. The woman came rushing over, breathless and apologetic, wiping her hands on her apron as she reached the little girl. Her blonde hair had slipped loose from a messy bun, strands framing a face that carried both exhaustion and grace. "Sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling beside her, "you can't just run off like that." Kaelen looked up from his seat on the bench. The little girl, still holding the edge of his suit jacket, pointed at him with complete sincerity. "It's okay, Mommy," she said. He was sad. The woman froze mid-breath, her hand still resting on her daughter's shoulder. Her eyes lifted to meet Kaelen's, clear, warm, but sharp enough to read him in a glance. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't recognition, not in the ordinary sense. It was something deeper, a quiet understanding between two people who knew what it felt like to carry too much. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, standing. She has a habit of talking to strangers like she's known them her whole life. Kaelen smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's all right. She's very observant." The woman sighed, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. That's one word for it. Then she turned to the little girl, her tone soft but firm. "Come on, Lila. Let's let the nice man enjoy his evening." Kaelen blinked. "Lila." He repeated the name silently, as if committing it to memory. The little girl, Lila, looked up at him again, unfazed by the world's boundaries. "Bye, Mr. Sadman," she said cheerfully. Kaelen laughed, a quiet, startled sound that surprised even him. "Good night, Lila," he replied, his voice softer than before. As they started to walk away, the woman, Ilera, though he didn't yet know her name, turned once more. There was hesitation in her eyes, and something else too, gratitude perhaps, or curiosity. "She means well," she said with a tired smile. "She just feels things deeply." Kaelen's gaze followed the little girl as she skipped ahead. "That's not a bad thing," he murmured. Ilera's smile lingered a moment longer before she nodded and turned to follow her daughter. He watched them go, the small, bright figure of the child twirling through puddles, her laughter echoing off the quiet buildings. For a while, he stayed there on the bench, listening to the fading sound of her voice. It lingered in the air like a melody that refused to end. He looked down at the space where her small hand had tugged his sleeve, that simple human touch, and found himself smiling again. It wasn't the rehearsed kind he used in meetings or photographs. It was smaller, gentler, real. Across the street, the woman and her daughter disappeared into a corner bakery, the golden light inside spilling out onto the wet sidewalk. Kaelen watched through glass as the little girl climbed onto a chair, swinging her legs while her mother ordered something warm. It was such a simple moment, a child and her mother sharing an evening treat, but it struck him harder than he expected. He thought of his own life, the endless silence of penthouses, the polished loneliness of boardrooms, the emptiness that wealth couldn't fill. And for the first time in years, he wished, quietly, almost shyly, that he could step into that kind of warmth, even just for a moment. The rain began again, soft and steady, painting ripples across the street. Kaelen stood, tucking his hands into his coat pockets. He glanced once more toward the bakery window. Lila saw him through the glass and waved, a wide, unfiltered grin on her face. He lifted a hand and waved back. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he kept walking, but his steps felt lighter than they had in a very long time. The loneliness wasn't gone, but something had shifted. A tiny crack had opened in the walls he'd built around himself, and through it, for the first time, a little light began to seep in. The city was softer at dusk, its sharp edges dulled by the fading light. Streetlights blinked awake one by one, and the low hum of traffic became a kind of background lullaby. Kaelen walked without direction, hands in his pockets, the faint sound of laughter still lingering in his memory, the laughter of a little girl who had seen through his silence. He wasn't sure why he'd left the office early, or why he'd ended up on this side of town. He just didn't want to go back to the glass and the quiet. As he turned a corner, a neon sign flickered in the distance. Eddie's Diner, home of the best pie in town. Warm light spilled through its windows, glowing like an invitation against the cold evening air. He paused. Through the glass, he could see people inside. Families sharing fries, a couple laughing over milkshakes, the cook flipping burgers behind the counter. It was noisy, imperfect, alive. And then, just as he was about to move on, a familiar sound broke through the clatter. "Mommy, it's him." Kaelen blinked. There, in the corner booth by the window, sat Alara and Lila. Lila was waving at him so enthusiastically she nearly knocked over her drink. Alara turned, surprised, and when she recognized him, she smiled a little hesitant, but warm. For a moment, Kaelen hesitated on the sidewalk. Part of him wanted to walk away, to retreat back into the comfortable invisibility of solitude. But another part, a quieter, braver part, told him to stay. He opened the diner door. A small bell jingled overhead. The smell of coffee and fresh pie greeted him, thick and sweet. Alara waved him over. "Hey, stranger. Looks like we picked your favorite spot." He smiled, stepping closer. "Seems so." "Come sit with us," she said, scooting over to make room. "It's not fancy, but the coffee's strong and the pie's legendary." He hesitated for only a second before sliding into the booth. The vinyl seat squeaked softly beneath him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to say the right thing or be the right person. Lila leaned forward eagerly. "Mommy says you work in an office. Do you get to eat pie there?" Kaelen chuckled. "Not the good kind." "That's sad," she said seriously. "Everyone should get to eat pie." Alara laughed, shaking her head. "You'll have to forgive her. She thinks pie solves everything." "Maybe she's onto something," Kaelen said quietly. The waitress arrived, setting down 3 mugs and a steaming slice of apple pie. Alara thanked her, then handed Kaelen a fork. "Go on," she said. "House rule. You don't leave here without trying a bite." He took a forkful. The taste was simple: warm cinnamon, flaky crust, real apples. Not imported, not catered, not designed for show. Just good. He closed his eyes briefly, savoring it more than he expected. When he opened them, Lila was grinning at him, chin resting on her hands. "See," she said, "pie fixes everything." He smiled. "You might be right." Alara watched him for a moment, her expression softer now. "Rough day?" she asked gently. He met her gaze. "Something like that." She nodded. "Then you found the right place. This place doesn't care who you are, only that you're hungry." There was no judgment in her tone, no curiosity about the expensive watch on his wrist or the tailored coat draped beside him. Just kindness. It was disarming in a way he hadn't expected. As they talked, time began to slip by unnoticed. The conversation meandered, light, unplanned. They spoke of nothing important, and yet every word seemed to matter. Lila told stories about her imaginary dragon friend. Alara laughed easily, her eyes sparkling with a warmth that reached the space between them. For the first time in years, Kaelen wasn't thinking about deadlines or numbers or who might be waiting for his approval. He was simply there, sharing a meal, listening to laughter, feeling the weight in his chest ease just a little. Outside, the city lights shimmered on rain-damp streets. Inside, the diner glowed like a small pocket of peace in a restless world. When Alara stood to pay, Kaelen stopped her gently. "Please, let me." She looked at him, amused. You sure? Pie, that's a serious thing. He smiled. I'll risk it. Lila giggled. That means you have to come back. To pay it off. He glanced at her, a hint of playfulness in his eyes. Then I guess I will. As they stepped out into the night, the air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of rain and city lights. Lila skipped ahead, her laughter echoing down the sidewalk. Kaelen and Alara walked a few steps behind in comfortable silence. She glanced at him once, then smiled faintly. You know, you don't look so sad anymore. He looked up at the glowing sky, exhaled slowly, and said, No, I suppose I don't. And as he watched the little girl twirling beneath a street lamp, Kaelen realized that maybe, just maybe, he'd stumbled into something he hadn't known he was searching for. Something real. The days that followed slipped by gently, like pages turning on their own. For the first time in years, Kaelen Vance began to live outside of calendars and schedules. No board meetings, no investor calls, just small, ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. He found himself returning to that diner, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for pie, sometimes with no reason at all. And every time they were there, Alara and Lila, they didn't make a big deal of it. No questions about his life, no talk of money or headlines. Just conversation, the kind that wandered freely. Sometimes, Alara worked a morning shift in a nearby bookstore and joined him after. Other times, Lila would burst through the diner doors ahead of her mother, waving a new drawing she wanted to show him. Stick figures of the three of them standing beneath a big yellow sun. He kept each drawing. Quietly, carefully. At first, Kaelen wasn't sure what drew him back. Maybe it was the way Alara listened, really listened, when he spoke. Or maybe it was the sound of Lila's laughter, that bright, unfiltered sound that seemed to fill every hollow space inside him. Whatever it was, it began to heal something he hadn't realized was still bleeding. One evening, the diner was nearly empty. The rain tapped lightly against the windows, just like the first day they met. Alara sat across from him, stirring her coffee absently, while Lila colored beside her, half asleep on the booth seat. You've been quiet tonight, Alara said softly. Kaelen looked up from his cup, caught off guard, just thinking about work. He shook his head slowly. No, about this. She smiled faintly. The world's most glamorous diner? He chuckled under his breath. Something like that. You know, I spend every day surrounded by people who talk, but somehow no one ever really says anything. Alara leaned her chin on her hand, studying him. And what do you think we're doing right now? He looked at her for a long moment before answering, talking, and meaning it. A warmth flickered in her eyes. That's rare, she said. It is, he murmured. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, blurring the streetlights into soft halos of gold. The sound filled the pauses between them, not empty but peaceful. Lila stirred in her seat, blinking sleepily. Mr. Kaelen, she mumbled, if you're sad again, I can draw you another sun. Kaelen smiled, reaching out to gently tuck her blanket around her shoulders. Thank you, sweetheart. But I think your first one's still working. Alara watched the gesture quietly. There was something different in the way Kaelen moved now. Slower, softer, as though the weight he'd carried so long had finally started to lift. She didn't know his story, not really, but she saw the loneliness that used to hide behind his polite smiles begin to fade. And for Kaelen, those evenings became something sacred, something that felt like home, not the kind built from glass and skyline views, but the kind made from shared coffee cups, laughter, and the small comfort of being known. He began helping out in small ways, fixing the diner's flickering light one night, picking up Lila's favorite strawberry milk on his way in. It wasn't much, but it mattered. To them, to him. Somewhere in that quiet rhythm of ordinary days, Kaelen realized he'd stopped pretending. He no longer measured life by success or loss, but by the moments that made him feel human again. And though he couldn't yet name it, he felt the truth settling deep inside him, that the greatest gift life could give wasn't power or prestige. It was this, the gift of normal, of belonging, of being seen. not as a man who had everything, but as someone finally learning how to feel. He looked across the table one last time that night. Ilara smiled, tired but warm, her hand resting near his. And as Lila's quiet breathing filled the space between them, Kaelen felt the edges of his old world, cold, glass, and empty, fade a little more into the distance. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing anything. He was simply there. And that, he realized, was enough. The rain had stopped that night, but the air still carried the weight of it, fresh, heavy, and full of something unspoken. Inside the diner, the lights were low, the evening rush long gone. Only 3 people remained. Ilara, wiping down the counter, Lila, humming softly as she colored, and Kaelen, sitting by the window, staring out at the glistening streets. He'd been coming here for weeks now. To anyone else, he was just a quiet man who liked black coffee and late dinners. But tonight, the mask he'd worn for so long began to slip. Ilara noticed it first, the distant look in his eyes, the way his hand lingered around the untouched cup. She set down the towel and walked over. "Long day?" she asked gently. Kaelen took a breath, slow and deliberate, as though steadying himself. "Not exactly. More like a long life." She smiled softly, unsure whether to laugh or listen. "That sounds heavy." "It is," he said quietly. "And it's strange. You can build an empire filled with everything you thought mattered and still feel like you're the loneliest person in the room." Her hand paused on the edge of the booth. There was a depth in his tone that hadn't been there before. "You're not just talking about work, are you?" He looked up, and for the first time, his guard was gone. The usual calm, polished expression, the one people call composed, controlled, had cracked. "No," he admitted. "I'm talking about losing things that don't fit on a balance sheet." The hum of the diner filled the pause. Somewhere, a neon sign flickered outside. He exhaled, eyes fixed on the table. "My father built the company. I rebuilt it after he died. I told myself it was for him, for the legacy. But somewhere along the way, it became a shield. The work, the noise, the endless climb. It was all easier than facing what was underneath." Ilara sat quietly, letting his words unfold at their own pace. "I was engaged once," he continued, voice barely above a whisper. "She left. Said she couldn't live with someone who wasn't really living. I didn't blame her. I'd forgotten how." His hand trembled slightly as he reached the cup, but he didn't drink. "I thought I was fine. I thought solitude was strength. But the truth is, it's just silence wearing armor." Ilara's eyes softened. "And now," he looked at her then, really looked. "Now I'm starting to remember what it feels like to want something simple, to laugh, to show up for people." He gave a faint, self-conscious smile, even if it's just for a pie. Ilara leaned back, studying him. "You know, Lila asked me the other night if you were famous." He laughed, caught off guard. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you might be," she said with a shrug. "But that it doesn't matter, because fame doesn't make someone kind." He looked down, hiding a small, genuine smile. "And what do you think?" She tilted her head. "I think you're someone who forgot how to be happy, and maybe you're trying to remember." The simplicity of it struck him harder than any truth he'd heard before. There was no pity in her voice, no awe, just quiet understanding. He felt the corners of his mouth twitch upward. "You make it sound so easy." "It isn't," she said softly, "but it starts with choosing to stay, even when it's uncomfortable." He nodded slowly, her words settling into him like something sacred. For years, Kaelen had hidden behind the safety of titles and glass walls, believing that vulnerability was weakness. But here, in this small diner with a woman who didn't treat him like a headline and a child who saw only the man before her, he finally felt something real. Lila suddenly looked up from her drawing. "Mr. Kaelen?" He smiled. "Yes, sweetheart." She held up her sketch, a tall man with brown hair standing between a smiling woman and a little girl. Above them, in big, uneven letters, she'd written, "Family." Ilara froze. "Lila," she started softly, embarrassed. But Kaelen only stared at the picture, his throat tightening. He swallowed hard, blinking back the sting behind his eyes. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you." Lila grinned, proud and innocent. "It's you." He managed a small nod. "Maybe it is." And for the first time, he didn't flinch at the thought. That night, when they said goodbye, Kaelen stood outside the diner for a long time, looking back through the window. Ilera was laughing at something Lila said, her head tilted, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It hit him then, not like a storm, but like sunlight breaking through fog. He didn't just want to visit this world. He wanted to belong to it. For the first time in years, Kaelen Vance, the man the world saw as untouchable, was finally being seen for who he truly was. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, just a man rediscovering what it meant to be human. And in that revelation, something inside him quietly, irrevocably changed. Morning light spilled gently across the city, soft and golden, the kind that turns even glass towers into something almost tender. The streets below stirred awake, people rushing to work, buses sighing at corners, the familiar rhythm of another day beginning. In a quiet apartment overlooking it all, Kaelen Vance stood by the window. The skyline stretched before him, a view that once defined his entire world. He'd bought the penthouse years ago to remind himself he'd made it, that he was someone, that the climb had been worth it. But now, it just looked like a view. Beautiful, yes, but empty without meaning. On the counter behind him sat a coffee mug, chipped, plain white, the same kind he used at the diner. Next to it lay a child's drawing, a man, a woman, and a little girl standing under a yellow sun. He looked at it for a long time, then smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep, somewhere finally at peace. Because somewhere between the late nights and the long silences, he discovered something he'd never found in all his wealth, his power, his empire. Something money couldn't buy. Connection, not the kind sealed with contracts or social appearances, but the quiet kind, built over shared laughter, gentle conversations, and the small, sacred act of being known. He still ran his company. The world still called him a billionaire, a visionary, a man of success. But those words no longer defined him. Now, success looked different. It was helping Ilera fix a broken shelf at her bookstore on Sundays. It was letting Lila drag him to park so she could show him how high she could swing. It was walking home with 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Kaelen Vance, the man who wanted everything and felt nothing, had become rich in the simplest way possible. Through love, through laughter, through belonging. He didn't announce it. He didn't need to. The change lived quietly in the way he carried himself, in the softness of his voice, in the ease of his smile. The world still saw CEO, but the people who mattered saw something else. A man who had learned that wealth was never about the size of a bank account, but the size of a heart that chooses to give and to feel. He glanced once more at the drawing on the counter. The crayon sun shone bright, uneven, perfect. He reached for it, smoothing the paper with careful hands, as if afraid it might fade. And in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Yeah, I'm rich enough." Outside, the city kept moving, cars, voices, noise, the endless hum of life. But somewhere, in a small diner with a flickering neon sign, a little girl would later look up at her mother and ask, "Do you think Mr. Kalen's happy now?" And Ilera would smile, glancing toward the door, as if she already knew. "Yes," she'd say softly. "I think he finally is." Because sometimes the richest people in the world aren't the ones who have the most. They're the ones who finally remember how to feel. And in that quiet, ordinary truth, Kaelen Vance had found everything he'd ever been missing. And that's how a lonely man learned that the richest moments in life can't be bought. Sometimes all it takes is kindness, a smile, a small voice, a reminder that we still belong. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV for more stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, keep your heart open